put it a cheesy 80s movie. And I think that you don't get that with Nightmare. And I think that is the compliments of like the great Wes Craven, the great Robert Englund, and just all of the amazing performances. And I was watching it with my wife, who had never seen it either, and she was blown away by the fact that this was Johnny Depp's first role. And this was Johnny Depp's first role because Wes Craven's daughter thought he was hot.
That I didn't know. That's amazing.
Yeah. It was down to him and another guy, and his daughter was basically like, you should hire this guy because he's cute. That's it.
Wow.
Well, that's what they wanted, was they wanted to introduce that kind of like heartthrob kind of character in the film, because all the other horror classics had their final girl that they focused on. But Craven always said that he didn't want it to just be one girl. He wanted it to be a guy and a girl to be the poster face. And Craven got his start in the slasher craze a little late as far as like icons go, because I mean, by this point Michael Myers has already had his first outing. Jason's getting ready to have his actual first outing because he wasn't actually in part 1. Leatherface had been out for almost 10 years, and out comes Wes Craven with Freddy-Krueger, the first real slasher icon that didn't wear a mask. And he just kind of set his own new rules, which I loved. And I had never seen any of the other films before. This was actually the first horror movie I ever watched. It was an old VHS copy that my mom found when we were cleaning one day, and she's like, I won't watch it with you, but if you want to go watch it, go ahead. I think I was maybe 6 or 7 years old at this point. I'm sitting down watching this film, and I was like, Mom, why are you so scared to watch this? This is amazing. She's like, okay, you're going to be one of those children. Got it. So they started ordering other horror movies that terrified her as a child through some kind of an online or mail-in video club thing. So like the next film that I watched, I jumped exponentially straight into The Exorcist. And I've been all horror all the time ever since. So I blame my mom.
Horror is such a great genre, and I know you, going back to streaming Blair Witch, horror in games is one of my favorite ways to experience horror because it's such a interpersonal reactionary experience, and it's much more immersive in that way. But I love that, Freddy Krueger comes out, like you said, he doesn't wear a mask. And one of the cool things this movie does that really caught me off guard, not knowing anything about it, was it really does a bait and switch early in the movie with you that you're led to believe Tina is going to be your main character. And then, of course, she's no longer your main character. And then you follow Nancy for the remainder of the film. And that, to me, I thought was such a cool, interesting way to open up this movie and really introduce those characters.
But then that ended up becoming one of Craven's like big things, because he did the same. He revisited the same concept later on when he did Scream. Mm-hmm. All of their marketing material was all about Drew Barrymore was the lead. Like we open up with her in the first scene, and then all of a sudden she's gone, and it's just like, oh, okay, well, who's our main character? And it became sort of Craven's signature on the slasher film genre.
I feel like I know Scream because I saw Scary Movie so long ago. I'm actually this weekend, so starting tomorrow night, I will be watching the Scream movies for the very first time as well. Oh, wow. So this is going to be a big October first for me.
So Scream was my gateway into the slasher boom, and it kind of gave me a thirst for who Craven was as a director. And Mike, I think you make a good point that Craven really had a very interesting way of going about doing things and like storytelling, and did misdirection extraordinarily well. And I think for me, like, that's the reason why I have fallen in love with him as a filmmaker. And particularly when he goes back and kind of does his pseudo Scream test in Wes Craven's New Nightmare. That's my favorite Freddy Krueger and Nightmare on Elm Street movie, just because it's so different, it's so intelligent, and it's just a interesting, underappreciated masterpiece in the franchise, because it basically brings Freddy to the dark place that I feel like this film couldn't necessarily bring him to because of a lot of the stuff that was happening at the time. And so when you're talking about Freddy Krueger is as Nancy's mom puts it in this movie, he killed 20 kids. And he basically got off on a technicality, and parents took up the whole Batman stance, took the law into their own hands, and burned him alive, basically. And I think for me, Craven has kind of gone on and done this in other interviews. And Dan, I would highly suggest this to you after you get done watching all these movies, and to any of our listeners. We put out a documentary a couple years ago called Never Sleep Again. And Never Sleep Again went through the origin and the inception of everything about not only the first film, but the phenomenon between the first film being released to Freddy's Dead, to the hunger for Freddy versus Jason, and the reboots, and it just encompasses the entire franchise. But he talked about in an interview for that film about how Freddy Krueger was actually supposed to be both a child molester and child murderer, because those are the worst things that you could think of. And New Line, I believe, was actually the reason that they dropped the former, because there was cases in California that were kind of happening around the same time. And so I feel like later incarnations that we get later down the line kind of bring the full vision of Krueger that Craven had intended to the limelight and to the spotlight.
Well, you guys probably know this already, and if you don't, we'll talk about it. But this Wes Craven got the idea of this movie. It's inspired by real events, which I don't think I realized. But when I was looking into the trivia, it was articles printed in the Los Angeles Times in the 70s. There are refugees fleeing to the U.S. from Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. They were suffering from disturbing nightmares to the point where they were refusing to sleep. And several of these men did die in their sleep. And this, spurred the mystery surrounding these deaths. And so Wes Craven, of course, heard about this, was interested in it, and then was able to make the character of Freddy Krueger surrounding, this scenario. The other thing that I found was interesting is that the name Freddy Krueger comes from a childhood bully of Wes Craven. Yep. And was he was bullied, and so he decided to attribute that to one of his most evil characters, and what would become one of the most widely known horror movies ever made.
He did the same thing with Last House on the Left. The villain's name was just Krug. He used that bully's name in a couple of his films.
Man, what a way to be remembered.
Right? Like, I bullied Wes Craven, and now I'm named after, or now I have the most iconic dream demon named after me for all of history.
Yeah.
Imagine being that guy right now.
Oh, man. I'm sure, maybe he's flattered. I don't know. Hopefully he's learned from his bullying ways.
Well, Wes Craven kind of gets the last joke in the end, because you're basically having multiple characters named after you, one of them being one of horror's most iconic characters, and you're not getting a cent from it.
That's very true.
That's fair. Yeah. I didn't even think about it like that.
I feel like that's what would kind of kill me with this, but I feel like too, Freddy Krueger, and we've seen this kind of happen, and we'll talk about it a couple times, but you cannot talk about the legacy of Nightmare on Elm Street without talking about the dreaded, depending on how you look at it, 2010 remake starring Jackie Earle Haley. And I think Jackie Earle Haley kind of proved to us once and for all that Robert-Englund is really kind of what makes this character his own. And I kind of want to ask you guys, like, is there ever someone else that you could see as Freddy Krueger? And at this bedrock that we're talking about here in 1984, how do you feel revisiting, or visiting for the first time, how Englund's performance comes across?
I think, and having not seen the remake, I do remember seeing the trailer for it when it was released, and I thought that it looked interesting. I guess it's not interesting, but maybe someday once I'm through all the originals, I will go back and visit that one. I feel like Freddy in this film was really well cast, and again, coming off of only ever seeing Freddy Krueger in popular culture. And when I was a kid, for some reason, I did end up watching Freddy versus Jason. That was like the one Jason Freddy Krueger movie I did see, so I had some frame of reference from there. As far as who else could pull off that role and cast someone, I don't really have any name that comes to mind. I feel like whoever I would want in there would need to be a really good character actor, because there's so much makeup and prosthetics involved. I would want them to really embody the life and soul of what Freddy Krueger is.
I always make jokes and say that the 2010 remake is an abomination, but as a standalone film, it's decent. It's a total reimagining of Craven's original vision. It brings in the original idea that Fred Krueger was supposed to be a child molester, which they hinted at in the original series, but they couldn't really go into that because Craven didn't want to be accused of exploiting all the high-profile molestation cases that were going on at the time. And in 2010, they could kind of just throw that out the window and say, okay, well, let's just make him a child molester and murderer. As far as Jackie Earle Haley as Fred Krueger, I think the problem with it is we're also accustomed to the wisecracking, realistic type Freddy Krueger that we got from Robert Englund, and Jackie Earle Haley gave us this monster version of Freddy Krueger. And not to say that Robert Englund was never the monstrous version, but we got the no nonsense, no wisecracks, everything's a lot more sinister version of Freddy Krueger, which I liked, but I missed the classic. And I don't really know who else I would cast in that role. It would have to be somebody who could kind of embody both, sort of like how Bill Skarsgård did with Pennywise. Like, I thought no one could live up to Tim Curry's version of Pennywise, but then you got Bill Skarsgård who came in. He was terrifying and funny and goofy and everything that Pennywise needed to be, while still updating things for modern times. And it was beautiful. Like, it was beautifully done in those 2-part films. But I don't think with the overall tone of the 2010 remake of Nightmare on Elm Street that Jackie Earle Haley could have played into that fun aspect of Freddy.
Yeah, that 2010 remake is dark when you're comparing it to a lot of the other series. And Dan, you'll come to know this, but anyone that's seen and has invested a lot of their times into this franchise, they know that when you go from Freddy's Revenge up until Freddy's Dead, you are encompassing this very goofy, very wisecracking, like Mike was saying, like very slapstick character. And he becomes more comically driven, I feel like. And when you look at this performance in 1984, you get a little bit of that. And you see it when he is kind of like messing with Tina. Like, there's a scene where he turns to her and he says, hey, like, hey, Tina, look at this. And he like holds up his hands and then he cuts off his ring finger and his pinky, and blood or whatever kind of things he has in his veins in his dream world starts pumping through the open wound. And you see that kind of stuff, like he's like stretching out his arms in one sequence. And then there's a sequence